wonderful to be with you. At the Rockefeller Foundation, our mission is to promote the well-being of humanity worldwide and to make opportunity accessible and universal and sustainable. And so it really is a privilege to welcome the U.S. Fellows, Eisenhower Fellows, and thank you for the work that you have been doing. I want to say thank you to George DeLama for his leadership, and also to my pal Diane Melley. We've been working together for so many years. I used to be in Philadelphia for about 15, 16 years and knew Diane from many days, many years ago. I know that the work that you all have been doing has really been about fostering leadership and finding your way to contribute more to the well-being of humanity. And I just want to say congratulations for your fellowships, and thank you for the work that you are doing. I think you just completed, many of you, a 6-week fellowship. Was it a six-week fellowship? So congratulations on that. And also congratulations on becoming alumni. We do have a program. I'd encourage you all to look at the Rockefeller Foundation's projects at the Bellagio Center. And the Bellagio Center is where I think my colleague Eason is here in the room, and he leads our Connected Leaders program and is really responsible for hosting you. It's his budget line that this great event will come out of. But he also works very closely with our colleagues in Italy, Bellagio, Italy, for that program. And that program is really about having and hosting convenings as well as residents for 4 weeks. Of course, you'd have to apply, and there's a scholarship that comes with it for leaders who are working on very specific projects to, of course, promote the well-being of humanity. And so I encourage you all to take a look at that. It is our pleasure to be in partnership with the Eisenhower Fellowships, and I'm wishing you a wonderful day. So thank you. And George, thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Really appreciate it. Good afternoon. I'm George DeLama, president of the Eisenhower Fellowships. It's wonderful to be here with so many formidable leaders. I want to thank Natalie and Easton Jordan, a fellow former tribesman from both recovering journalists, here from the Rockefeller Foundation. Thank you for hosting us and generously donating this space today. We appreciate your support. We're gathered here this afternoon for what I'm sure will be a spirited discussion about the progress, or lack thereof, of women's leadership over the last 5 decades. From the end of the 1960s, when the women's liberation movement imprinted itself on America's moral and cultural consciousness, to today, when for the second time in 8 years, the United States has chosen not to elect its first woman president. I'm sure our panelists, I imagine they'll have something to say about that. By way of context, I'm old enough to remember a popular television ad in the late 60s and 70s for Virginia Slims cigarettes. They were marketed to women, and the TV slogan was, "You've come a long way, baby." Well, you can't say that in public anymore, and for that matter, imagine having ads on TV for cigarettes these days. But the Virginia Slims ads back then referred to the relatively short 5 decades that had passed since women first gained the right to vote in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. So back around 1970, it hadn't been very long that women had even been allowed to cast a ballot, or for that matter, to smoke in public. Now here today, we'll look back that far again, just 50 years ago, to explore how far have we come since then? How far do we still have to go? To take us on this journey across the decades, we have with us today a distinguished panel, intergenerational panel of accomplished women leaders from diverse fields. Each will share their perspective about a separate decade when they began or significantly accelerated their careers. Here to moderate this discussion is my dear friend and longtime colleague, Deborah Amos, an extraordinary foreign correspondent for ABC News, National Public Radio, and the Public Broadcasting System. Known for her courageous reporting from the Middle East, Deb covered armed conflicts from Lebanon to Iraq to Afghanistan and Syria. She's the author of 2 excellent books, Eclipse of the Sunnis, Power, Exile, and Upheaval in the Middle East, and Lines in the Sand, Desert Storm and the Remaking of the Arab World. Along the way, Deb has won a number of journalism's major awards. These days, she's a Ferris Professor of Journalism in Residence at Princeton University. And in another incarnation, Deb and I were Nieman Fellows together at Harvard University for a year. where the highlight of our time there was that she and I organized a potluck dinner for Julia Child, which is a whole nother story. Deb will introduce our panelists this afternoon and kick off this timely conversation. With no further ado, let's please welcome our host for today's discussion, my friend, Deborah Amos.
That was great. When George called me and asked me if I would be interested in doing this, because it was George, I knew it was a test. If I had a good story, I'd get to come. So the story that I told him, which was a true story. There's mine. There we go. Yes, this is how we do this. I used to work in radio. The story that I told him was this. When I got out of college, I studied to be a journalist. I was an affirmative action hire. Everybody needed one of me when I got out of college, which is how I got my first job. And that was fine. I went on to work for National Public Radio after I left ABC News in Orlando, Florida. And many years later, when I was at ABC, a young woman came to my office, Korean American, and she said, "How did you start in journalism?" And I said, "I was an affirmative action hire." And she said, "What were you?" And I thought, we win. Anyway, that's my story of the 70s. So now I'm going to introduce the people on this panel, and we will talk about how far we've come, how far we've not, and what about that election. I'm going to start with Frances Cook, an retired U.S. ambassador. Her last post was the ambassador to the Sultanate of Oman, and she was the first female ambassador in the Gulf. That was something. Jane Harman, former 9-term U.S. representative, Democrat from California, President Emeritus of the Wilson Center. Becky Ann Baker, award-winning film, stage, and television actor, I suppose we say now.
I say actor mostly.
And you were the mom in Girls, correct?
I was the mom in Girls.
Wow.
But more importantly, I was the mom to Ted Lasso.
Ooh.
That was the one that, because it's more current.
Yes, precisely, yes. I watched Girls, but not Ted Lasso.
Oh,
so
okay.
That's
There
how
you
I
go.
know, yes. Diane Melley, Senior Advisor, Eisenhower Fellowships. And look at the women in this room, kind of amazing. And finally, last but certainly not least, Fatimah Mohammed. She's the Ambassador and Permanent Observer of the African Union to the United Nations. Welcome. Welcome, all of you. Thank you. I'm going to start with you, Frances Cook. You come from the 70s, like me. And I wondered if you can talk a little bit, without straying into the election right away, because we all want to, if you could just talk about what we got in the 70s that was, that we got to keep.
That's the hard part. Let me first of all congratulate all of you on being Eisenhower Fellows. I've known quite a few of your colleagues. You are stars or you wouldn't be here. And you're able to connect internationally now, and that'll be very supportive in your work. My whole career, I always met with women. I was always the first woman every place I went, and I always had special meetings just with women to encourage them. The world will be a whole lot better place when women have more leadership roles, which we didn't prove yesterday, but it's coming. The 70s were a tumultuous time for our country. I didn't remember how bad it was until I went and did some research for this meeting. But there were two important female events which happened. Roe versus Wade was decided in the Supreme Court, which was just, as you all know, overturned with the last court and was a major feature in this election. And the Equal Rights Amendment was voted by the Congress and still is not U.S. law. It still is not U.S. law, the Equal Rights Amendment, which I find extraordinary. And Margaret Thatcher became the first female prime minister in England. So there were some very interesting and good things that happened for women in the 70s. Against that, it was a catastrophic decade for our country. We had Watergate and Nixon's resignation. We had abroad, there was the massacre at the Munich Olympics. Domestically, we had 3 Mile Island, a meltdown, our first nuclear disaster. And abroad was even worse. Pol Pot took control of Cambodia and went on the murderous rage you all know. Saigon fell. The Shah of Iran was overthrown and 52 Americans were made hostages for a year, and led to the defeat of Jimmy Carter, for whom I worked. And for a good cap on the year, in December, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, where they stayed for 10 years. So the 1970s were pretty catastrophic for women, too, on each of those things that I just named. But there were some historic accomplishments that still are unrealized or being overturned, but we've been there before, and we can go back again, I think, I hope.
And it's a moment when the women's movement, because women become annoyed with men mansplaining about Vietnam and
Yes.
other decide, all right, we're done. We're going to do
Absolutely.
this on our own.
Absolutely, absolutely. You have to take charge
Yes, and we did.
and be verbal.
Jane Harman, can you talk about the 80s and why women who take these roles, especially as you did in Congress, what they bring to the table?
I'd be happy to, but let me go back to not the Equal Rights Amendment, but women's suffrage, because George mentioned that, and as you heard, I am now President Emerita, not Emeritus, of the Wilson Center, which I headed for 10 years. Woodrow Wilson was the president at that time and was against women's suffrage. It was his second wife and his daughter who pushed him to ratify the amendment. So there. So it takes women to help women, and think about the fact that that was just 100 years ago. It's pretty shameful. So I was not elected to Congress until 1992, which was called the so-called Year of the Woman, when the number of women in the House doubled. And I'm trying to remember when Governor Whitman was elected governor. 1993, same year, right? So anyway, that was a fabulous decade. Back up to the 80s, since you did ask me about that. Ronald Reagan was president. I don't think it was that memorable for women, as I recall. But one thing that he and George H.W. Bush, who followed him, did do was they ended the Cold War. And it's relevant to the 90s because the Cold War ended in 1989, and the U.S. mistakenly, as it turns out, assumed we won, everyone else lost. And when I was elected to Congress in an aerospace-dependent district in Los Angeles, we thought that the world was safe. We could downsize the defense budget and the defense industrial base, while, oops, we missed it, China was building up. The Russians had enormous grievance about the way they were treated after the end of the war, and terrorism was on the rise. And so it turned out that the world we imagined was not that world. And I actually wrote a book about it called Insanity Defense when I left the Wilson Center. But about women, this Year of the Woman in 93, was called that because we doubled the number of women in Congress, and 2 women represented California for the first time, Barbara Boxer and Dianne Feinstein. Both turned out to be admirable senators, and women got on the major committees of Congress. There had been almost no history of that. There was a woman named Pat Schroeder from Denver, Colorado, a wonderful woman, who was I don't know if she was the first. She might have been the first woman on the House Armed Services Committee. And Ron Dellums, who came from Berkeley, California, was the first black man. And the then white chairman of the committee said, well, oops, you can't both be on this committee because we only have 1 seat. So what did they do? It was just a fabulous idea. They said, we'll share it. And so the 1 woman and the 1 black man shared a seat on the committee for a while until this fellow moved on. And now on all the security committees of Congress, and I served on most of them, there are plenty of women. And why shouldn't there be? So I thought the assignment was to also talk about why I think, and I've just shared this with some of the Eisenhower Fellows, so I'm sorry if I'm boring, why I think women lead better, certainly in legislative capacities. And I think that the reason is that we usually, not always, are the managers of our households, our children, our aging parents, and other related activity. And we learn early that to do that, you have to compromise. You have to work with other people and maybe take what you can. 70% is not a bad number. The perfect should not be the enemy of the good. And we come to legislatures with skills that involve doing that. And we, certainly it was true in my case, we work with other people, think children, some of them behave like children, to resolve problems. And if you do that, you can get a lot done. We also don't have to take all the credit. And call each other bad names, which I think most of us don't. And it is still true, even in the Congress now, which is fiercely divided and dysfunctional in so many ways, that both houses have women's caucuses, and both of those caucuses are bipartisan, and they meet for lunch and they do things together. And which doesn't mean they agree on everything, which doesn't mean every woman is something that is someone you would admire for all things. But an example is, I was asked before, what did I think of Kamala Harris doing some events with Liz Cheney? I thought that was a great idea. And Liz Cheney is somebody I know and like very much. We agree on about 10% of things, maybe, on a good day. But I admire the fact that she stood up and said, in the case of some of his transgressions, that Donald Trump should be impeached, and I'm going to advocate for that. And she did, even at the cost of not only her leadership job in the Republican caucus, but her job in the United States Congress. And good for her, and good for her for staying on that message. And I think, in spite of the fact that both women did not have a good day last night, or a good night last night, that there are many more chapters for each of them.
Thank you. You think that she will not end in jail? It's been, I mean, Trump has threatened her.
I understand. He's also threatened Nancy Pelosi and, and Mark Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and a lot of other people. And let's see. I mean, will he politicize the Justice Department to the extent that it goes after his enemies list? He can try that. I think, something to keep in mind, maybe you disagree, is one good thing from last night is that we had a fair and free election. Democracy with a small d worked. And yesterday I was at lunch in Washington, and there was plywood over all the storefronts, just anticipating, some horror. I think the plywood's coming down. And so, did we elect the person I would elect? No, definitely not. Not ever. But hey, we did 50% plus in the country decided that they preferred him over her, and she has, so far as I know, I was just reading this, conceded and offering a concession speech at 4 o'clock today, which is all about the orderly transfer of power. It's what you do in a functioning democracy. So at least for the last 12 hours, we have retained a functioning democracy.
This is good. Becky, I'm going to ask you to talk a bit about the 2000s.
Oh, I've got the 90s.
Oh, go for it.
Yeah. I mean, you said a little about the 90s, and I've got that's okay, because I've got some numbers that speak to that. 1992, Year of the Woman, was the House went from 28 to 47 women, and the Senate from 2 to 6, which is remarkable when we consider. And today we gained 2 female African-American senators, I believe. So, I mean, I know I'm personally devastated today, just devastated. And, but to look at these positive things are the best thing to do today. Women's participation in the workforce in the 1990s grew to 60%. 1991, 2/3 of married women with children worked. 1993, Janet Reno, first female Attorney General. 1997, Madeleine Albright, first female Secretary of State. And 1993, RBG, Supreme Court by Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton actually contributed a lot to hiring and, making women, giving women a more important role. What else did I have? Oh, the 90s were girl power in fashion and youth movement and all these wonderful things. And Sally Ride went to space. Geraldine Ferraro was the first VP nominee of a major party. And Alice Walker and Toni Morrison both won the Pulitzer Prize. So I was looking for everything positive I could find today about the 1990s and women.
Let me ask this to an actress. One of my favorite quotes in a recent profile piece of Kathy Bates, who now is reviving Matlock.
And wonderfully so, yeah.
Indeed. And what she said was, and it so stood out to me, I talked to my friends about it, and they was, yes, we saw it too. She said, women my age are invisible, but that just means they don't see us coming.
Oh, isn't that great? That's so great.
But I want to talk to you about the first half of that sentence, because I wonder, as an actor, if you know that, that there is a sell-by date. There is in the media, we know that. And so I wondered if you felt that at a certain age you were just...
You know, it's interesting. I've had such an odd career. I came out of Kentucky, and I was a chorus girl. I was a singer-dancer. My first show I got from an open call, and it was the original cast of The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas. And this is 1978. And this is, this young kid out of Kentucky with absolutely no contacts or any kind of, and can walk into an open call and walk away with a job. My entire career has been unexpected to me, just completely unexpected. And what I'm finding at this age is that I'm not invisible. I'm actually gaining strength playing these roles of mothers. But they're all mothers, but they all have different stories. And so it's been fascinating because I'm actually having a more exciting career in the last, say, 10 years than I did altogether. So I do agree with Kathy Bates because, yeah. But I understand what Kathy Bates is addressing. I think we all understand that.
I think we all understand.
Yeah, we definitely all understand that. But professionally, I find that I'm just a lucky girl,
From Kentucky.
From Kentucky.
Okay, Diane, you want to talk about the 2000s or any other 10 years you want to talk about? That seems to be the pattern here, so as you wish.
Thanks, Deb. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Diane Melley, and also, as a backdrop, I was a 37-year IBM executive, so very much spent most of my life in a very male-dominated industry, which I have to say, and I think this is good news, was very, very fair to women. Entering into that industry in its infancy, always felt supported and really encouraged to really advance my career to the highest level. Ironically, back in the 1980s, while I was in college, the U.S. was about 51% women. So there too, on the college campus, you didn't feel that there was any disadvantage to women. And now, in our country in the 2020s, 58% of the people in America on campus are women. So those numbers are really encouraging. But then you peel back. I was a computer science major, started in technical development, developed air defense systems in the Middle East, in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, had amazing projects in my IBM career. When I entered the technology industry, women majors in computer science was peaking, I only know that now, not then, at 37.1% in 1984. That's when it peaked for women in computer science. The number today is 18%. The number of new young women entering computer sciences majors, 18%. So we're going backwards.
Why is that?
And well, I'm going to tell you some other numbers,
Okay.
so then I'm going to
Go
tell you. And I don't have all the answers, Deb, but we can kind of say, well, what's positive? So 26% of women in the technical professions in our country. The environment for women overall, very welcoming to women in the technology industry, but as you move up and advance your career, the numbers start to look radically different. So women in the C-suite, and for all of us, those are the CEOs and the direct reports to the CEO, 10% are women. Senior vice presidents like myself, that peaked in 2019 at 18% in our top 3,000 companies in America. It's now down to 13%. Again, these numbers are going in the wrong direction. And to your point, Deb, why is this happening? There's a number of different reasons. We think that the good side is that the technology industry has diversified in terms of the types of professions, and women are choosing to not go the ones that require deep math. So they're picking data analytics, they're picking graphic design, support fields around the very technical systems engineering kind of roles that I played. So there are some options. The numbers are a little bit deceiving there. But what we have seen is that in the 90s and even into the 2000s, all of the media was advertising personal systems use and personal computers and gaming, always targeted at young men. So we raised a generation of young women that didn't think that they could compete in this technical industry. And I'll end with one story, because I always like to be positive about it, because again, I never felt, and I see another fellow IBM woman executive here, the way that we operated in the corporate world, you came into a culture that had basic beliefs of respect for the individual, of achieving excellence in everything that you do, and putting your client first. And what I was very supported, and like I said, I look back now and say, oh my God, when I first became a manager, I hardly knew anything. And I had all men working for me. So I had tremendous opportunity. But I think male mentors and male allies are what made me successful. And only these last 5 years since I've retired from IBM and am doing consulting, do I see how much more work really needs to be done. So think about this environment. It's technology, it's male dominated. I'm a young woman, computer science, technical. I get my first promotion in the early 90s into my first executive position. And I acquire a territory which has one of the biggest failing projects for IBM in the country. At that time, it was large, 25 million, very big one. And I'm looking at Christy, she probably knows it was a bridge authority in that tri-state area. We were installing the first ever on the East Coast toll collection system. IBM was the Easy Pass system, first in the, I believe that was only in the 90s. And because I'm sure the young people here think, oh, that's always just been there, right? We were the prime contractor, and we were doing the construction work, installing the sensors and the cameras underground with all the construction work, and we were also doing the technology. So they say, oh, this project's in trouble, go down, I make a call on the executive director of this bridge commission. It's a few weeks before Memorial Day weekend, which is the busiest time of the year for that bridge. I walk in, I introduce myself, and I'll never forget it. It flashes back at me as if it was yesterday, and it's many years ago. He says to me, I can't believe they sent a blankety-blank skirt in to do a man's job. And I just held my head high, talked through what the plans were going to be for how we were going to attempt. And I didn't say we were going to solve it all, because we were not going to solve it all. We were not going to have all the lanes of that bridge open by Memorial Day weekend. So anyway, we had the meeting, go through it all. He's not happy at all with IBM and not happy with me. Go back to the office, right to my regional director's office, say, okay, he took it pretty well. We're going to do this. We might get 5 of 7 lanes open, everything in terms of the business solution. But what happened next is why I'm telling you this story. I say to Ron, I go, okay, so I think that's the plan. I think we're going to be all right. I said, but you know what? I didn't appreciate that he called me a skirt. And he said, what? And I said, yeah, at the start of the meeting, I tell him what happened. He did not even take a breath. He picked up the phone, landlines back then. He picked up the phone, he called the client, and reamed him out and said, this is what we believe at IBM. A woman can do everything and maybe better than men, and don't you dare ever talk to another IBM woman executive or any executive. So I just absolutely love that, because he lived the beliefs. He put one of our biggest clients at risk without even taking a breath. So that's the kind of world that I grew up in, and the supports, and I think is really encouraging, because all the women leaders in this room, as you're going forth, you can set the table. You can put the beliefs, your personal beliefs, into the organization that you're running. And when those moments come, you can do the right thing, and in the long run, it will pay off. We could have very well lost that customer, but he would gain support from myself and every woman in that organization to always support those beliefs and do the right thing for people.
Thank you. That's a great story. Fatimah, I want to talk about 2 years, 2010, because that's what we're doing. But I also want to talk about more than 30 years ago when China, there's a conference for women, and we're coming up on an anniversary. So probably more on the China moment than the 2010, if you don't mind, to tell us where we are and where we've come from.
Okay, it is. So first, let me start by congratulating all the fellows in the room. I'm also a proud Eisenhower Fellow. I was selected for the first ever African Fellows in 2016. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it then because I was running a campaign. It's a different story. But I was fortunate to have been invited back in 2017 for the Global Fellows. And since then, I've remained very much in touch with the fellowship, and I'm really, really happy to be here. When Deborah started out, she asked what good came out of the 70s, and the first thing that came to my mind was me. I am a baby. I am a baby of the 70s, and I'm really proud to be part of this distinguished panel, because, you know, looking at the women sitting on this panel, we stand on your shoulders. And I would just like all the ladies, especially in this room, well, everyone in this room, to join me in giving them a round of applause, because but especially for the women, because a lot of what we're able to achieve today is because of women like them. So I consider myself very, very fortunate. Now, in terms of where we are, what has happened in the last 2 decades, and especially your point about the Beijing Declaration, which actually happened in 1995, and it wasn't on your list, but it was a very important point for women.
I was there.
Aha,
It was
voila.
absolutely magical.
Exactly, and next year we're going to be celebrating 30 years of the Beijing Declaration and its action plan. So I think it's a very important point for us to review how far we've come. But there has been, as you've heard from the other panelists, a lot more in terms of political representation, in terms of economic participation, as well as global influence. We're talking about politics in the United States and the elections, and I have to admit I did change a little bit my talking points after I saw the results today. But I think what is important is what we learn from the experience, and maybe the comments I'm going to make are more from a global perspective, because elections in the United States, the world's most powerful country, has a huge influence on the rest of the world. And the leadership and how the leadership sees women and women's leadership also has an impact on us. So it's going to be interesting to see what next year is going to bring when we look at Beijing plus 30. In terms of representation for us, I'm from Nigeria, West Africa, and we saw the election of the first female president back in 2005, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in Liberia. And the following year, 2006, she was sworn in. And this year, I'm happy to say, in a couple of weeks, actually, I'm leaving for Namibia for election observations to hopefully see the first female president being elected in the southern part of the country. And there's a Southern African here in the room. So in that sense, I think there's been a lot of progress in terms of seeing women's leadership. In terms of corporate leadership as well, we see more and more women breaking the glass ceiling. In some cases, it's a glass cliff, as they say, where women are kind of set up to be on the edge. You see them failing not necessarily because of how bad or mistakes they've made, but because the environment was set up in such a way that they were put there to fail. We've also seen a lot of social and cultural shifts, especially in terms of discrimination. And this has given birth to a lot of movements thanks to social media, such as the Me Too movement. And there's a lot more focus on women's empowerment thanks to Beijing. The SDGs, of course. We are focused more on issues that concern women and girls, issues linked to poverty, education, health, and so on and so forth. And I think there's a continuous push for equity. Women are able to, using those policies that exist, be more vocal in terms of issues that concern women. They are able to find allies, partners in the men that work with them. We just heard a great example here, and we have to continue to have those allies. Despite the figures that you gave, there has been quite a lot of progress in tech and innovation. We're doing a lot of work in terms of education of girls, especially in the area of STEM at the UN. And there have been a lot of policy changes and accountability. So what I'm hoping will come out of Beijing Plus 30 is that we will be looking again and reviewing some of the decisions that we took 30 years ago, do an assessment of where we are today, and see how we can move things forward globally for women, not just in the United States. But I must say that in the United States, a lot of the decisions that happen here affect us globally in terms of policy work. And maybe the last thing I can say to that is, even at the UN now, with the results of the elections, there's a lot of thinking in terms of what is going to shift. Someone mentioned Roe versus Wade. Is that correct? Roe versus Wade? But also in terms of the discussions we're having within the UN with women's rights, how that is going to affect decisions and some of the progress that we've taken. Thank you.
So let's get to the part where I know that we all wanted to talk about, which is the elections. Nobody got any sleep last night, so that's partly why we just might as well do it. And this election had so much to do with women and women's rights. Not only was it for or against abortion, the idea, even on Monday, the early vote, more women had voted early than men. And so I don't know if we know all the lessons of this election yet, but I wonder if each one of you could address, are you now convinced that it's sexism that stops us from electing women, or is it something else? And do you think that this is an earthquake for us as females, or the election was about something else? Let's start with you, Frances.
It was an earthquake for me. I wasn't expecting this outcome. I think it will be a challenge. We'll have to see who he names to various jobs. As before, he actually had some pretty good people. He had a lot of really bad people. We'll have to see how they carry out his mandates. A lot will depend on whether or not the Republicans take the House. If they take the House and they already have the Senate, we will have elected somebody who can do whatever he wants, basically, because the Supreme Court has already been set up to favor his views. The Supreme Court already is set up to support things that he wants. So we'll have to see what happens. The House of Representatives election has gotten terribly more important today than it was yesterday because the Senate is gone. So I'm very concerned about it. I think the demographics on who voted for whom are going to be astounding when you see them. And you're going to be surprised and disappointed, I think, at some of the way people voted. And the one thing I would caution, because I've worked in, I think, 10 countries in this room, or traveled to some of them many times. As people go to democratic elections, the poison that's in our system is going to be in all yours. It's already there. It's called social media. And we have a huge percentage of Americans who don't watch the news or read newspapers anymore. They just listen to social media. And here I'm not talking about Russian, Chinese, and Persians getting involved in our social media. I'm just talking about Americans say to Americans. and it's truth sort of doesn't matter. It just spreads on social media, and people believe it. And I don't. It's very bad in the third world too. It's very bad every place I've ever lived, but it's getting much worse because it's facilitated. So I think that's the thing to watch out for in coming elections. But we'll have to see where it goes from here. I just don't know. Sorry, but I'm very disappointed.
That's okay. Jane?
Well, on that cheery note, let me say first, maybe I've said this. I know I said it at lunch. Again, apologies. It was a fair and free election, and that is worth celebrating in a democracy. It really is. And that more than half the people made the wrong choice but I'm not biased, is going to be our problem. But nonetheless, they made a choice. They went to polls that were safe. They sent in ballots that were counted, and they made their choice. America's not unique here. We may be the biggest and most powerful, but this populism and isolationism and sort of command strong man, they're all men, heads of countries is happening around the world. And let's understand, it's, the Middle East is different, but in Europe, certainly, the elections in the UK, France, Germany, et cetera, all have challenges like this. Look at Hungary. Canada, Trudeau is extremely unpopular. There have been changes in governments in Asia, et cetera. So we are on a long list of I think, countries electing the wrong leaders, and it's very sad. I was talking to Christine. I don't want to out her because she'll talk about this tonight. However, there is an argument that both political parties are broken. The Republican Party is now more or less the cult of Trump, and the Democratic Party is sadly very out of date in terms of identity politics and things of this nature, which I just don't think apply anymore to the electorate we now have. And so could a third party be better? I'll let her answer that later. I never thought so because I thought that third parties, at least in recent history, would cause the less bad party to lose, and I think that's been our history. But maybe our history has brought us to this point, and we have to rethink. So this may be the start of something very different. Final thing I would say is back in the day when I was a staffer in the Senate, and by the way, I worked in the Carter White House, and when I began my career in Congress, the goal was to solve, the business model was to work together to solve hard problems for the country first. And if you worked with someone in the other party and you solved a hard problem, you were rewarded. And there were many famous teams of Republicans and Democrats who were able to work together. And two who come to mind, no longer with us, are Ted Kennedy and John McCain as examples. But at any rate, you were rewarded for being bipartisan. Now the business model is blame the other side for not solving the problem. Because if you work with the other side, you are bipartisan, and then you get primaried, which was never a verb back in the day. And in most cases, at least for the House, the primary is the election. And the more extreme party, the more extreme faction of either party is the one that shows up in primaries. So people are pushed apart, the center is not valued, and surprise, surprise, there are very few people in Congress anymore who would have the courage, who do have the courage, to work across the aisle with somebody else to solve the problems. So we're not solving the problems. One perfect example was the Senate actually stepped up recently to develop a bipartisan immigration bill, which could have become law. President Biden was prepared to sign it. He should have acted on immigration years earlier, in my view. But at any rate, he was prepared to sign it. But Donald Trump said, I don't want it to pass. I want to use it as an issue in my election. So where we end up is he got elected, and immigration is still an issue.
I am devastated as well. The only thing, it's so amazing to listen to you, both of you, especially with your political knowledge. But for me, I'm wondering where we go in terms of messaging, because you're right, we aren't a great deal of the people that voted for Donald Trump, I have a feeling, aren't getting their information from reliable sources. And I think a lot of our social media, I've seen many, many, many little clips of things that we know aren't true. So I guess my biggest question is, how do we get back to informing our population in a firm, concrete way that, you know, is not filled with lies? And I feel like the vote would have gone a different way if we were able to do that. So that's where I am.
And I'm humbled by the expertise of my fellow panelists here. So I will answer yet again from a corporate leader perspective, where I think the positive side of this is the enormous numbers that we've seen vote in this election, that voted early. The young people, the record-breaking numbers of 18 to 21-year-old people who voted and may have had a huge impact on the results of this election. So I think the popular vote and how significant that win is. It's not electoral college vote win solely. The numbers are there. So from a corporate perspective, it's good. We're engaging people. And having led in corporate social responsibility for 22 of my 37 years at IBM, we were always trying to encourage people to show up, to speak, and to step up and lead. So I think we're hearing from the American people what they want. And I think the corporate world has done really good work to and lead in giving benefits to their employees, to encourage them, to give flex time, to give paid time off. There's something called rating and ranking for companies, which actually ends up in a lot of cases affecting their stock price, because certain funds do not want to buy from companies that are not socially responsible. And so companies are really taking this seriously. They're not saying what way their people should vote, but they're wanting people to be civically engaged and engage in the process and engage in solving problems. So I think the sheer numbers that we're seeing is positive, and the corporates are doing their part to get people out there. They can't determine the outcome, but they can do their best to try to get people to really take it seriously and really think about the type of leadership that they want and the future that they want for our country.
Well, thank you. I think my perspective will be slightly different, not necessarily from a national perspective, but maybe from a more global perspective. I think for us it's more about ensuring or seeing that there isn't a reversal in terms of global policy, that the U.S. Continues to remain the leader that it is on the global platform. There are concerns. We've already had an experience of 4 years previously, so I think it's more in that sense. But if I can say just one point that I wanted to mention earlier, and is particularly linked to the UN elections, is the positive side of what has come out of this is also in terms of the issue of intersectionality, right? Being able to see today the issues of gender, race, and political inclinations coming together, to be able to see someone that comes from a very diverse and not, the traditional background that you see in terms of leadership in this country, be able to make it as a candidate for the presidency, I think is also a positive thing and very current in terms of where we've come, how far we've come in terms of women's leadership. So maybe I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
So Diane, you made me really think about where we are in saying that we've already passed some peaks of jobs for women in tech, that you actually can go backwards. But what I want to ask all of you is this notion of backwards. We have gained quite a bit. I think it was shocking when Roe versus Wade was reversed, because we did not believe that would happen. And I think all of us who are old enough to be there when it was passed, that has been probably hit us harder than it did to younger generations, is my guess. So what I'm going to ask is, we've had such progress. We have women who are in business. We have men who run companies who've gotten more left in the past couple of years and promote these policies of advancing women, advancing diversity. That's a change in the culture. And on the other hand, we had an election where this was the first time that the bad part got said out loud, both on race and on gender. The last round of the argument was, what are you going to do if your wife doesn't vote the same way you do? And people were, Republicans were furious with ads that said, she doesn't have to tell you. I mean, that was so telling to me that it was like, what? My wife will vote differently than I do? How is this possible? That, it was a reflection of some part of the country. So the question to all of you is, do we really lose something in this election of women's rights and the notion that we should be treated equally and have every right to take high-powered jobs in whatever field that we're in? Do we really lose this time, or is this some watershed for women? And it looks bigger because of Roe versus Wade. Francis.
I really don't. I don't have a view because I'm still digesting everything that happened yesterday. I do think a lot will depend on people that he names to offices and what they do with the policies. He said everything on every issue. You can choose a range of when he does what they call the weave, where he gets up and sort of goes. So we'll have to see which policies are actually implemented. And in Washington, to a large degree, I hope Jane will agree, people are policies that matters, who he puts in various agencies and so forth. The pioneering work that Lena Khan's done, for example, will be over for sure. But we'll see what he does, who he names, and what kind of policies they actually implement. There's a lot that can be done. I'm sorry, without the microphone. There's a lot that can be done with executive orders in our government, more than people, I think, outside Washington realize. So there's a lot that can be done that way, and we'll just have to see which ones he said so many things, we don't know what's going to be in what order. And a lot of it will depend on, and I think they'll start acting before their people are confirmed, which is going to be very quick in the Senate, since they just took control of the Senate, but there was a process involved, including security clearances and so forth. So I think we're just going to have to see which policies he really promotes. I don't think women necessarily will lose, but I think that it's highly likely given what his backers were.
Jane.
Well, on a depressing note, I'm thinking about the women of Afghanistan. And don't we remember that they had 10 years or so or more of growth, attending schools, being leaders, being in business, and so forth, and then through a series of gross miscalculations, not entirely at the fault of Donald Trump, but I frankly think the Biden administration made a big mistake to negotiate only with the Taliban after that. The Taliban came back to power, and now women of Afghanistan are in the Stone Age again. So it can happen. There are really bad consequences from bad leadership. What will happen here? I think that it could be wrong. I mean, I agree that executive orders can cause a lot of harm. There's a recent Supreme Court decision about, acting in one's official capacity, the immunity decision, which will give Trump added power. Congress is pretty dysfunctional, so it will be hard to block bad stuff. However, I think we have more resilience in our country than sadly Afghanistan did, and I don't see that happening. I see social media, which has been a force for bad, also possibly a force for good, certainly around women's rights, because so many of the big movers on social media happen to be women, and I don't think that they will agree to be pounded back into the Stone Age. So I'm hopeful. He wasn't my choice, and I think it matters what we do now. If we go home and drink tequila, which is my instinct, but if we drink tequila and then get back out there, that's fine. But if we just drink tequila, not good. And so, I mean, it's in some ways up to us.
So, Jane, to compare us to Afghanistan and say that we're better, that's kind of a low bar, but I get your point. I do get your point. But we aren't going to the Stone Age, but we could go to the 50s. And I wonder, for somebody who's in Congress, you know those women, will they stand for that? I think they won't. They will fight.
That's what I'm saying. I don't think they will stand for it.
Yeah.
I think we're not Afghanistan.
Yeah. But it does feel like the 50s. I do feel like, that is the overall message that I feel like we were sliding back into the 50s. And I do agree that who he's going to name to this cabinet and who he's going to name, period, is going to be just a revelation, because he now knows, after those prior 4 years, who he doesn't want to talk to and who won't do what he wants. So I'm terrified. But I agree that we have to stand firm and do whatever we can, one foot in front of the other.
Diane, in business, do women lose places, or do people just say, okay, that's Washington, we ignore this? Our culture is different.
That's an excellent question, and it's funny. I had said to Sarah Al-Harte, who's our 2024 fellow from Saudi Arabia, when I first met her 6 weeks ago in Philadelphia, she brought back memories of my trips to Saudi Arabia and to Kuwait, where, believe it or not, back in the late 80s, pre-Gulf War, there was no cloud. When you were building air defense systems and you were building fleet material support systems for the Air Force and Navy, you went over on installation trips. And I saw the culture, as a young American girl. I was so fascinated by the fact that the women didn't drive, that the women didn't go to university. It was just such a foreign world to me. But again, the corporate world said corporate culture, American culture, trumps the environment that we're sending people into. So the American leaders in the Air Force and Navy and the American business leaders at IBM said, no, we're sending women in. We're very respectful. We were trained about how to dress and how to behave. But I sat at the table with the officers from the Royal Navy and from the Kuwait Air Force with the men, and was the only woman at the table. And their women were back in the kitchen in another room having their dinner, and they would ask me kindly to go speak with them with some of the most fascinating conversations. So fast forward to today, where those women were asked to be in another room. The numbers are record-breaking in Saudi Arabia for the women graduating with STEM degrees now. So I am an eternal optimist that our culture in America and our corporate culture, where there's been nothing but advancements, and the corporate world often leads with some of their policies. So now you see young men are getting 3 months minimum paternity leave. How wonderful is that? When I had to have my babies, one of my babies is in the room, we won't embarrass her. We got 6 weeks off, and the whole time you were off having the baby, you were working the whole time because you were so nervous to get back. Young women now in America, 6 months, and their partner, spouse, whoever, gets 3 months. That's progress. That's like, we're not. I agree with Jane. There's no way we're going back. The young women, Americans, the men that support them, we're not going back to the 50s. We might have a little hiccup here, but we're not going to let this go.
We certainly can't let Saudi Arabia get ahead of us on this one. But a lot of progress has been made, and we are not going, yes, I think we are not going back. Fatimah.
No question?
And the question is, do you think we lose anything? You have been making this question a global question. What happens here never stays here. It has an effect on policy, UN discussions, and you've been alluding to it in every one of your answers. And so I wondered if you thought that what happened last night will have an effect on UN policy, or if the women in the organization will say, as Diane said, I'm sorry, but we don't go backwards.
Well, certain policies, without a doubt. I mean, because we've seen it happen previously during its previous leadership, and I gave an example earlier on. The U.S. withdrawing from certain UN bodies, for example, which are critical, areas such as human rights, for example, where we expect U.S. leadership and where the U.S. is absent, will obviously have fundamental impacts on the rest of the global community. And then it'll be interesting to see what the UN position is going to be in terms of the geopolitics and the current world context in terms of conflict, right? What is going to happen with Ukraine and Russia? What is going to happen in the Middle East? These are things that we have to be watching very carefully. For us in Africa, for example, the U.S.'s role in Sudan, in the Sahel, for example. I mean, we're going to have to take it one day at a time, because if we start speculating now, I think all of us are going to end up with a heart attack maybe by the end of the day. But yeah,
We go back to the tequila answer.
yeah, exactly. I don't drink, but I'll join you with orange juice.
Now what I'd like to do is open it up to your questions. Excellent, because we want to hear from you. You're the next generation who are going to have to deal with this. So can you state your name and a question, please?
Thank you. My name is Zaiga Puca. I come from Latvia. And my question is, I think it was The Economist where I read this article about the Generation Z and Alpha, about that gender gap, like in gender roles, is getting very big in these generations. Like, the women are getting more independent, they want more rights, they want to be there, and the boys are getting more conservative. So the article was about that it's the first time that there is such a big difference in one generation. Because normally it was between generations, but now it's like a gender difference. So I want to ask you questions. How do you see the future in that? Like, about what we are talking, that women want to be independent, want to take part in every sphere, and the men or the young boys that are growing up now, thinking that that's not okay. We don't want to, and also what you said, right? You need men as a mentor. So how do you see how we can solve that?
Anybody want to take that on? Go ahead.
If I can start with that, I think the very important point that you've made, and very often we have these discussions within the context of education and training and capacity building for women. And we often say that we shouldn't leave the boys behind as well, because these are the potential partners of these young girls in the future. So that's a fundamental point that we have to be conscious about whenever we talk about women's and girls' empowerment. But I don't think we need men, and I thought I heard you say mentors. We need them as allies, and I think I alluded to that in the beginning. Them understanding the challenges and the gaps and having them there as allies, because I think we complement each other more than anything else, and it's not a competition. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Anybody else?
Can I add to what she just said?
Sure.
So back in Sri Lanka, Okay, my name is Saroshi. I'm from Sri Lanka. So back in Sri Lanka, just adding to what she said, this gap is also huge. So one of the reasons women go forward, they just march forward, whereas males are taken, they're very sort of like very conservative roles. So there is a huge clash between the two genders. So this is really bad for the next generation, kids, the families. So the social divorce rate within Sri Lanka is also very high. This is not the legal numbers, but the social divorce rate. So they're very, at different ends, extremes. So one of the reasons why we started like a program called Fathers Program, promoting positive masculinities within Sri Lanka. So creating like a club of 5,000 fathers who will be male champions, who will stand with women, and who will champion women's progress, and who will talk to, other colleagues, promoting equitable fathers, responsive fathers, and nonviolent fathers. But problem is, now when we started this, there was so much of pressure, so much of resistance coming, one side from the males, one side from religious groups, one side from feminism groups as well. And I know for a fact some of the UN organizations, they have decided, okay, they had positive masculinity programs, but unfortunately they're discontinuing this because they have a question mark saying, what we have limited resources, we should invest in women's programs, not empowering or talking to men. So we need to. They have been like excluded far too long. We need them to get into this discussion, progressively support us. Otherwise, we can't. We talk about violence. We only talk to women. But perpetrators, we don't. They are also within like a victim circle. Yeah, just wanted to add that remark.
Do we have to recognize that that was a sub-theme in this election?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is fascinating. Did everybody see the movie Barbie?
Yes.
The American movie. Do you remember poor Ken when Barbie has taken over and he needs to be revived? Yeah. But I think the rise in gun ownership in the U.S. is directly related to this. Poor emasculated men have to own a gun to feel that they have some power. And it is something that has to be addressed. I'm not sure what the answer is, but it is absolutely a major problem at this point.
Anybody else want to talk about that? Yes, and somebody pointed out to me, I didn't read it, but somebody pointed it out to me, that the #1 bestseller in the New York Times is The Age of Anxiety. And what you're talking about comes into this. I see it with my own students, that we are in an age of anxiety, and that's one of the factors, I think, in it. Question, yes?
Oh, well, first of all, thank you so
Hang
much.
on, we have microphones that will come to you. Ah, you've got one, excellent.
Yeah, I might. Hi there. Thank you so much, first and foremost. I think that I'm definitely on the tequila train still with yesterday's news. And so
Right after this panel.
Yeah. Amen. My question really is about how the Democratic Party seems to have so completely just sort of failed to read the room. And I'm asking this from the perspective of someone who's in the millennial generation, so we don't get as much airtime these days as Alpha or Gen Z. But I'm also part of the creative class. I work in the arts. And what I really see is folks who are in my sector, they're leaving the country. And they're leaving the country, A, because they can. We are so fortunate as Americans to have strong passports. But what's really seems to be permeating is this sense of a lack of seeing a future. And I think this is a pretty significant issue to raise, and so I wonder, is this really a gender issue, or is this more about how capital has changed, has power changed, and the degree to which our political system here just isn't quite dealing with that? And so I'm wondering, what could be the mechanisms? Is there a future? Do you see folks responding in that way?
I'll just say one. I think the Democratic Party needs complete retooling, and I think that the way we have segmented people into race and gender and so forth is really a problem. But I'm more bullish than you are on opportunities, especially in this country. We have an incredibly strong economy, even if most people don't know that we do. The corporate sector is very fair to women. The political sector is too. I mean, I'm sad that Kamala lost, but I wouldn't generalize from that women can't win political office and can't hold power in both political parties. I think they can. And I think, federal politics is not the only outlet. At the state and local level, there is more opportunity, I think, for women now. But my point is, I'm not sure about the arts, but I think it is true that the arts are pretty open to women too. I just don't see the trends that you see. But you are right that the Democratic Party failed to read the room, and identity politics has to be completely revamped. And we have a young woman over here, Christine, who's going to do it.
So more on that later, but this notion about people leaving is happening everywhere. Russia, tons of Russians left the country since Ukraine. Tons of Ukrainians have left the country since the Russian invasion. Tons of Israelis have left because they don't like what their government is doing. I mean, you see it everywhere. And that speaks more to mobility than to politics, the fact that you can do it and make a new life someplace else. makes that attractive. I mean, I've been thinking all day, fight, move, I don't know. Tequila, fight, move. Because I
I'm
know
starting
I can.
something here.
Yes.
I want to know if Ike drank tequila.
Okay. Research project to come.
His great-grandson is in the room. Nico, do you know? He was more of a whiskey. There you go.
Okay, got that answer. That's great.
Old fashions for everyone.
Okay. Yes.
Thanks very much for the panel. So actually, I was curious about your views, Deb. I loved your story about the glass cliff, and well, the story that affirmative action is done. But with regard to the glass cliff and just hearing Diane's story about allies who actually spoke up and was willing to potentially lose a client to protect the values, I just wondered, in terms of helping women across the glass cliffs, do you think that as much progress has been made, and would we be going back on that one?
I don't have any figures, but I can tell you in journalism, you can see it. There was a time when I got out of college that people would actually say to you, I'm sorry, we don't hire women, and did it, didn't think anything about it. So yes, that has changed. We don't need affirmative action anymore, but we still do with diversity in newsrooms. I mean, the argument that everybody makes in a newsroom is you won't know a story. You can't. If you don't have diversity in your newsroom, you're going to miss a lot. Yeah, you can read about it, maybe send somebody out. You need it way before that. And so newsrooms are now realizing that it's not just, doing it for Boy Scout points. You get something for it. And I think that corporate America is figuring this out too, because if you want to sell to a market, you better have the people who understand that market. So that part I do see changing. And it has to do with money a lot of times, and culture. But you know more about this than I do.
Well, I was going to comment on money specifically because I think equal pay is a great way to look at are we at. So with everything that we're talking about, all countries are different. There are different maturity levels in their advancement of women, and different industries in business are at different places. In large corporate tech, there's pay grades. There's actual codes, and you get in trouble as a manager if you're not paying off that grade for the performance level of the people. So I think we've done a really good job in corporate America, in the tech industry, in equal pay, because it's very skills-based. It's, do you have certifications? Do you have the necessary experience? You're able to calculate it, right? But I think we see it, and it's huge right now, women in sports in America. And so the fight is never over. These different elements, you just see the fights on all these different tracks. And I give a lot of credit to the WNBA right now, which is led by an amazing woman who came out of corporate America, who understands all these policies and how to make it happen. And I don't know the exact number, but it was fascinating that these women, that Caitlin Clark, the woman that was just the most amazing college player ever, she came out and she was getting like a fraction of the salary. So she'll make a lot of money in her endorsements, but she's only getting a fraction of the pay. But look, here it is, 2024, that's surfaced. I remember being in high school, I thought I was going to be playing professional basketball. My coach called my mother and said, there is no future for her. She can go to college on a basketball scholarship, but why don't we send her on an academic scholarship, because there is no there is no professional sports for young girls in the 80s. And that's a long, long time ago. So we're only in the arena of sports for women getting to the issue of pay that was addressed in the corporate sector beginning 25, 30 years ago. So it's all over the map, but I do think it would be interesting for us to kind of look at all these different issues in the different industries, and there does appear to be a maturation cycle of what you would tackle first, which policies need to be in place to create the culture, to your point, of men really being on the same team as you and not trying to, as you said, stop you or, God forbid, set you up to fail. But to me, pay is a huge thing, and I really applaud the WNBA. They're going to make massive quick movement right now, but it's kind of like the star being overnight. They've been fighting for decades, but it's just now at the turning point.
So I had a moment in the 1980s where NPR announced that it was going to look at, the salaries, equal pay. And out of nowhere, I got a $10,000 raise. It's like, wow. And then I went, wait a minute, because I knew what it meant. I knew what I'd missed. But there was nobody, so no one talked about it. It was just, there it was in your paycheck, and you realized, aha, I get it. I was happy to have it, but I did know what it meant.
Yeah, the arts are famously, I mean, the disparity of salaries in the arts all across the board are terrible, just terrible, even now. So good luck to you.
You and then you. Oh, you already have the mic, so let's do that and then we'll come back to you.
Okay, so I wanted to go back to, I'm Carolina Dake from Colombia. I wanted to go back at what Ambassador Cook said regarding how social media played a crucial role in this election in having non-factual information running around and just making people's mind out of it. I personally faced something very similar. 4 years ago, we lost an election where I was managing director, something of the sort. I was not the candidate. But we lost it when all of the polls said that we were winning, and there was actually a fake news that turned the tables, and all of a sudden then we lost by a very, very low margin because people actually believed it. So my question is, after seeing what actually can happen and how it can turn something that people said and pollsters said, even a river would have more chances of going back than this election, and then we lost. So what I wanted to ask is, do you think that there is a role that should be played by the traditional media in going into content in the social media, maybe by capsules, by other types of contents that they must be taking to this scenario, or is it a regulation issue? Should we get to some kind of a regulation where you can actually get sanctions out of creating fake news and promoting and sharing information where you have no verification of what the information is? So that was my question.
So two things. One, the regulations are coming.
I want to piggyback if I can.
Yeah.
Also, the how people. Oh, sorry. My name is Tita, and I'm from Rwanda, and I was right there. And I'm just also wondering on how people are consuming the content. And it's really funny that you were talking about the WNBA when you talked about the equality of pay, because I actually represent NBA Africa in Rwanda, and I remember when they decided to create this new league, because not only are they getting paid a fraction of what NBA players are being paid, but en plus, now they're getting stopped from playing out abroad to be able to supplement the salary. So it's the two prongs there. One, the right to gain, be able to supplement your gain in the way that you, like negotiations of contracts. And two, now that we are consuming content in very snackable ways, how do you translate traditional news and make sure that people get the right information and the right amount of it when people don't want to give you more than 3 minutes?
Nobody knows just yet. There's a couple of things that are happening to try to mitigate, but you're right that all news is now snackable to your generation. And that is a problem. Because you like TikTok, you like short, and you can't deliver real news short. You can't. So let's just assume that we don't know what's going to happen with that yet. And how? Can I have a show of hands? How many of you listen to podcasts on 1.2 or 1.5? Yeah. They do it. I know. All my students do it. I've learned how to do it myself because you can get more done. But anyway, it is shortening your attention span, right? So, but on the other side, the zone is so flooded with social media. So not only were the Chinese, the Russians, and Iran flooding, so were 22-year-olds working for the Republicans and 22-year-olds working for the Democrats. And they were all watching each other and all copying each other. So you were getting it like a torrent if you want. Now, so until we see all the numbers, I don't think we know yet. And three, that the Europeans are beginning to regulate, and I can't imagine that people in Congress won't notice and ask for it.
Well, it's complicated, though, because of our First Amendment. I mean, most people support freedom of speech. Our Supreme Court now, certainly the bad decisions it's made, not this court, on campaign finance law, shows me that the First Amendment is used to block regulation in ways that shouldn't be used.
May I just say a quick word about foreign information? I noticed in this election that we are letting our intelligence services say things very quickly when it comes from abroad. For example, there were 2 bombs on election day in Georgia and somewhere else, and they immediately told the supervisor of the elections in Georgia that it was Russian disinformation. We did the same thing with the invasion of Ukraine. When everybody was saying it wasn't going to happen, we declassified CIA information, said yes, it is. So I think on the foreign information, we can be very fast. I think AI will have a role to play in all this. I'm no expert on AI, but it can go very fast, and it's going to use a lot of energy, but I think it's going to sort things out in ways that we don't yet understand, and it could be positive. I think there's a lot of things could be positive about AI, actually, and this social media problem, which is global. It's not just us. The EU has spent more time focusing on how to handle it than we have, and with the Congress we've got coming, I'm not very hopeful that we're going to do it there. But in terms of foreign things, I think we're doing a pretty quick job on it now, which pleased me yesterday when I saw that happening. But on domestic things, this is very complicated. I've had an executive assistant since I retired from the Foreign Service, and I subscribe to 4 daily newspapers. I'm old-fashioned. I suspend them every time I leave. They're not interested in reading them. All they want to do is read a website that agrees with their views. And how you get past that, they're all college graduates, most of them are in graduate school, is a real challenge, and it saves me a lot of money on newspaper subscriptions. But it bothers me deeply that they aren't interested in, and I'm first to admit I don't focus on the Wall Street Journal editorial page very much, but it's a very good newspaper. So I tend to do that a little bit too, but I find if you have a newspaper, you read a lot more broadly than you do if you're just looking at a website that agrees with what you're saying. So we're going to have to see what happens with AI with all this, but I think that's probably the only real answer. That's in the future. Right now, you can't compete with it because people just are not watching regular television and not reading newspapers, and they listen to something that supports their views. It's not used to educate; it's used to affirm, and that's scary.
And even in podcasting, there's no fact checking.
What's that?
You might have Elon Musk as minister now.
Yes.
Elon Musk as minister.
Yeah. Well, no, he's going to be in charge of government efficiency where he's never worked, so that's going to be an interesting thing to watch.
We have 5 minutes left. We have one. I know, you've been waiting the most. You get the last question because you have been wonderfully persistent.
Yes. So thank you very much. My name is Hannah. I'm from Indonesia. Just a little bit context. Indonesia is, we're currently, we just elected a new president. And the current president is a very populist one. And his vice president is the kid of the former 2 terms very popular president as well, Joko Widodo. And one of the documentary back home in Indonesia is named Dirty Vote. There's one on the opening, they mentioned one sentence that I think is really interesting. It says that each one of us Indonesian who chose Joko Widodo, we are part guilty of what is happening currently. His son being the elected vice president and already sworn in. So my question is, I used my vote 2 times in the past 10 years. I used it again this year, of course. As a woman and a young woman, how do we make a difference? How can we be heard amongst the populist policies? And women empowerment is not a topic that is popular for the current government. What would you suggest that how can we make change in this era? Thank you.
Sounds like here. So, anybody? Fatimah, you look like you're thinking.
I am. A lot of things going through my head, but maybe bringing it back to existing policy, referencing what has already been achieved and building on that, but also staying focused in terms of what it is that you want to achieve individually, because gaps exist across the board in when you talk about women's empowerment, it's so broad. You know, it's sectoral. It's so broad. So I think focusing on what exists in terms of policy and building on that and staying focused in being true to yourself in terms of what you believe in. I think that would be my advice. Thank you.
I would just add, this is almost full circle with how you started the panel. When we were starting our careers, women's voices weren't heard. But we got heard, not just us. But if women are good and effective and don't, in my view, play the women's card, say, oh, you know, society is against me, oh, poor me, but just do your job and use your voice, if this whole room does that, the world gets better. So I think the right answer is just don't quit and stay in the fight. And the fight is different. The tools are different. Mis and disinformation is a very hard thing to get over. And what happened last night, I think, is a stunning reversal. It really is. I didn't expect it. I think looking back on some of the clues, I should have expected it, but I didn't expect it. And it is baffling to me that some women voted for the man who will be our 47th president, given all of his personal history. Women did this, and I don't think all of their husbands made them. I mean, maybe in some cases, but young women did this, and they don't have an understanding. We were just talking about Roe v. Wade, our decision that was overturned by a recent Supreme Court decision. They have no memory of life before that. Well, we do, and so I think history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. I think it's rhyming, and not just in the United States, but everywhere.
Let me just pass on some advice I got early on, too. They said, if there's no place for you at the table, pull up a chair. Okay?
That is a great place to end. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, very, very much for this. And I thank our panelists for spending 90 minutes explaining the world and commiserating with this group. So thank you, everybody.